Hey everybody, it's Alan Morrison with another episode of the GraphRAG Curator podcast. I'm really delighted to have Aaron Philipp with us today. Aaron is somebody I've known from my PwC days, and back then he was a director in the cybersecurity consulting practice, and just a really sharp guy when it comes to graphs and nowadays agents and how to take advantage of the technologies that have materialized. So Aaron has a fantastic background. He was a partner at Ernst Young, and lately he's got a new gig as the founder of VisibleARC, which helps with decoys and harnesses the power of generative AI in that construction of those decoys. So, Aaron, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here, and congrats on all the success on the podcast as well, my friend.
Well, absolutely, and yeah, just going to be tapping your brain today about things. I wanted to level set here for those who don't know you. Let's hear about your background and how you got into this stuff. What your interests are.
Yeah. So probably most important for the audience for this, really been a computer scientist kind of my entire life. Started out going way back, doing some novel fractal cryptography stuff when I was really, really young. Studied computer science at University of Texas. While I was there, just intersected with the very end of Dijkstra in his career, who was obviously formative in a lot of graph theory, and picked up. That was actually where I was first introduced to the concept of graph theory, and really have pulled that through my entire career. So written a few books. My domain expertise really sits in cybersecurity. So I've written books on computer forensics, on hacker techniques, those types of things. I've run large kind of global practices. When you and I first met at PwC, I was building out platforms inside PwC that would essentially do large scale security analytics. We partnered up at the time with Google, did some stuff with Palantir as well. Really focusing on how we can use scale and bring some of those graphs out to large scale, and solve interesting problems. As you mentioned, from there I went on to EY, and now I'm at VisibleARC, company founded that, as you mentioned, really uses diffusion models, not necessarily to create new images, but to create net new synthetic networks. So being able to synthesize on the fly a factory, some kind of IoT system, an OT system, a hospital, any of those types of bespoke environments. In addition to that, we've also done a bunch of custom IC work, developing small edge devices that we actually then can miniaturize the diffusion model into and run at the edge as essentially mini pods of deception, where it makes sense in specific kind of localities and regions for data sovereignty and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of the nickel and dime tour of my background. If there's anything you want me to drill into, I'm happy to.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the edge computing, and what kind of customers are you talking to right now? Can you give us a sense for just who's taking an interest and what they're asking about?
Yeah, it's large multinationals mainly,
Uh-huh.
right? So it's
Right.
really it's organizations that, well, multinationals, governmental organizations, those types of things as well. Obviously, whenever you talk deception, there's always going to be governmental interest and that type of stuff. But organizations that already have fairly mature security models, that have data sovereignty issues, where they have a bunch of different distributed sites, those types of things. That's really where the the tool shines, because it then feeds back into their instrumentation, allows them to better understand what's coming next, what's over the horizon in terms of tactics, tools, processes that the adversary may use, and allows them to build from there, right? So it's not, the target is unfortunately not like SMB type companies. It may move into a managed service at some point where we start looking at that as an information collection platform for threat intelligence, those types of things. But right now, it's very much so focused on the more mature kind of customer.
Yeah, and so when you're talking with customers, I know one of the services you offer is maturity assessment.
Yeah.
What process do you go through to sort of evaluate their maturity and see if there's a fit there?
Yeah, look, there's your standard kind of inside outside box, like capability maturity model stuff, which is the CMMC.
Right.
That's kind of your, what I would call meat and potatoes type assessments. And you're obviously looking for fairly high scores on that, but then also risk profiles, right? So organizations that have a higher targeted profile than your typical organization, either because of where they do business, what they make, where they're positioned in the industry, those types of things as well. So
yeah. So when you talk to execs at those kinds of companies, what are they thinking about right now most? What kinds of things are coming to mind for them? What are their pain points that they're bringing to you?
yeah, look, I mean, I think right now, and understandably so, I think everyone's head is kind of spinning as it relates to, I think it's old news at this point for those of us who follow it, but I think it's important to call it out just as a point, that like the fact that 91% of AI deployments have failed in the enterprise and in corporate environment, right? And so right now, every major corporation is going through an optimization play where they're trying to do more with less, right? And they're making big bets that AI is going to allow them to do that, but they don't really fully have a construct about how to make sure they're part of the 9%, not part of the 91%. And from my perspective, you and I first started talking in the big data wave, hype wave, and the rules for the big data hype wave are actually pretty much the exact same as they are now for the AI hype wave, which is have your fundamentals in place, have a data strategy, understand your business deeply and structurally, and then start to move forward with some of the initiatives that then you can bear fruit, right? Because otherwise, if you just went and built a data lake, well, congratulations, now you just have a data lake that you can't fish in. And and then now if you just throw a bunch of documents, you throw a RAG system at a SharePoint site that just has a bunch of documents on it, congratulations, you've now created a hallucination machine, right? And it's just going to pump out whatever it wants to pump out. So
yeah, the SharePoint example is an interesting one because so many companies have abandoned SharePoint sites, or they're just struggling with search and that kind of thing. How do you help clients get beyond that point where they're struggling with what they're trying to use from SharePoint?
Yeah, this is not a new thing either, right? This is like I remember 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we were dropping Google search appliances in the enterprise because those were going to be key, because now we have the Google tech inside our four walls and there it goes. And it's like, well, no, that didn't really work, right? Like, and so it's these things are not panaceas. Like at the end of the day, the transformer, the LLM system is still just a statistical inference machine.
Yeah.
And it's going to infer on whatever you give it. And it's going to, if you don't give it structure, it's going to make best guesses based on whatever, whatever ones and zeros it happens to be flipping on that given day. Right. And so the hardware, and this is really tricky because this does not hit marketing material because it's kind of boring and expensive and it has a long, cycle.
Yeah.
But it's the hygiene, man. It's the putting together the actual structure of the, what does our organization do? How do we do it? Like, companies that went through like RPA and were actually somewhat successful with RPA are actually really well positioned because they have a process understanding now that no agent is going to give you. There's just not the tech's not there yet, right? And that's not to say it may not get there. And I know, companies like Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palantir are pushing really hard to find ways to kind of automate some of that ontology generation, things like that. But like, as it stands today, I haven't done the deep dive on it, but I would guess a majority of those 91% of failures occurs because the organizational understanding isn't there as a prerequisite before that deployment occurred. So.
Yeah, exactly. And RPA is an interesting example. I read your blog post about that. By the way, everybody, Aaron blogs prolifically on LinkedIn, and he's got some really helpful advice on his blog site there at LinkedIn. But we went through the RPA hype. I was still at PwC when that started, and
I was at EY.
Yeah, and it's like all the banks were interested. They were talking about reducing headcount with RPA, and for those who aren't familiar with RPA, very rule-based orientation to bots, and so pretty rigid approach that can be pretty brittle. But as you point out, there's a lot of detail in that code, in that RPA code, and you could just mine that for this context that you're trying to build. Is that true? I mean, so
go ahead.
No,
go
I know.
Ahead. What I was going to say is, not only that, but just the exercise of building that brittle code and making it work, even if it only worked 80% of the time, like that's an organizational insight and an organizational understanding that will have a multiplicative effect when you then take that into agentic AI, right? Because that's the AI is not as brittle, right? And so it can round those corners out a little bit, but it still needs somebody to point it in the direction, right? And so even if the RPA, because RPA promised a lot of really, really big things when that was kind of at the top of the hype cycle, and even if that was a quote unquote failure from an implementation standpoint in terms of hitting those goals, where it put the organization from understanding what's happening inside its four walls is a massive leap forward, and should, like, instantly, anytime you're doing any kind of agentic AI, anything within the organization, you need to look back at your RPA Rolodex and say, hey, was this something we looked at? Were these processes we looked at from an RPA standpoint? Because that will be a massive accelerator and cost saver going forward.
Yeah, and so are there other sources that come to mind as well? I mean, RPA is obviously a rich one, but in terms of getting that context that you need to drive this agentic approach, what other sources are you helping companies tap into?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it splits into two different what I would call kind of like structures or frameworks, right? So on one side, you have what I would call kind of the automation side, where the agentic AI is kind of fulfilling the promise that RPA made 10 years ago. And then the other side of it is the knowledge side. And I think it's useful to structurally kind of separate those two things out, because one is a knowledge management problem and the other is kind of an organizational process optimization problem, right? And in order for agentic AI to work at scale inside the organization, you kind of have to have both, but that doesn't mean you can't run it in very targeted, high need areas. Whether it's you're operating in a region where you don't have talent, and you can't hire talent, you can't bring talent in, there's data sovereignty laws and those types of things, right? Those types of small scope tasks are perfect for this type of kind of agentic AI, because it's a very scope problem set. It's a very small data set usually, and it solves what is a massive need. And so going after those types of problems first versus trying to reorient, not to knock on the customer service side, but I see a lot of stuff right now about agentic AI completely reorienting all customer service. That's going to be a heavy lift, right? That's going to have to go into an organization that pretty much just wants to rip people out because they've already got everything else so finely tuned that the agentic AI can swap, right? For the rest, you're going to have AI hallucinating back to customers. You're going to have all kinds of security issues. You're going to have processes being broken. The AI gets jailbroken. Somebody gives it the wrong prompt, and it goes off, and all of a sudden gives them a $20,000 refund, right? Those are the types of things that, and if you don't have that stuff really well structured, because there's nothing stopping a human from giving a $20,000 refund today either, other than process, right? And so, those kind of bigger lakes and bigger oceans, start with the small high need stuff first, and prove that you can actually make it work in the organization, and understand truly what the friction cost is, and how much process reengineering or process understanding and data reengineering or data mining you're going to have to do to actually be able to get there.
Yeah. So thinking about a big four firm, for example, and having experience with RPA, and in the case of EY, they've got a good KM shop, and they've stood up this knowledge hub where they've got much more reuse of the documents that the KM shop is managing. It seems like you've got the opportunity to really tap into these sources and bring them together to bear on the agentic AI problem. And so I don't know, would it help to think about a use case? Is there an example that comes to mind where somebody's just starting this process, but they've got the maturity and the capability to do it? What's a likely place to start?
Honestly, let's take the consulting, right, angle for a second. The amount of time that goes into getting things into PowerPoints and refining PowerPoints, and not just the strategic viewpoint of the PowerPoint, but the actual this needs to be 1 pixel over, and this needs to be 1 pixel to the right, and this needs to be up, and this needs to be down. And where I see these things actually really playing out, I'll give it two. One is those types of, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what generative AI can actually do to solve those types of problems, where you give it an outline and it gives you back the ideal kind of PowerPoint with graphics and everything else. I think that's ultimately going to be a huge thing. And I think where you're seeing this now is in web front-end development. I don't know if you followed the web front end development kind of ecosystem for the
Not
past year,
not
but
not recently, no.
yeah, but the quote unquote vibe coding stuff, right? Which is actually
Uh-huh.
like a really an interesting like offshoot of all this, um, is just going after that segment extraordinarily hard because front end is hard. Front end developers are kind of few and far between, and you know, people want to be able to just have something create a pretty front end for the thing they do. And so people are, whether it be startups or even corporations, um, are pouring huge amount of money into tokens that they wouldn't do for other type of development tasks for the front end, because even though it's not perfect, it's still pretty darn good and get you there. And so I think it's going to be tasked, for organizations with where to start. It's really going to be those types of things where either one, you're spending an inordinate amount of time dealing with it, like your consulting firms and your PowerPoints, right? That's silliness to have someone build $250 an hour to format a PowerPoint. That's unsustainable, and that's got to change, right? Similarly, having startups and having really good ideas being held back because they don't have the best front end, also problematic. And so by stepping into that gap and giving, because if you look at it like a quote unquote full stack developer,
Mm-hmm.
full stack developers kind of stop at the like reactive front end side. Like
Yeah.
they can do it, but like it's still a little bit of voodoo, right? And so having something that plugs that gap, enormously helpful and a huge accelerator, and a very scoped task, right? You can draw it out in Figma, or you can draw it out in a piece of paper, put the picture in, and it gets reasonably close, and then you can refine it from there. And so I think
Yeah.
those two, like, I know those aren't like huge groundbreaking, oh, we really need to change like our entire process system around, but like they're proof of concepts, they're fairly low risk, and they show some really, really interesting results.
Just thinking back to what little I know about this, I sort of remember that when I was interviewing Adam Kimball earlier this year. Um, Adam's a deep technologist like you are, and he basically says, "Yeah, I'm using Gen AI a lot, and it's really helping me in my work." And so you contrast somebody who's just totally fluent like Adam is, or yourself, with
I'm the same
somebody
way.
who,
I do the exact same thing, just to be clear. Yeah, I'm 100%. I don't like. I very rarely write a lot of code that's not AI assisted at this point. So,
yeah,
but
yeah, for sure, for sure. But you have that awareness that helps you ascertain what to ask for and what's right and what's wrong. Contrast that with somebody who's a noob essentially, or just out of school, and they don't have your experience and your insights into what constitutes a good code, for example. But in the case of a good PowerPoint, I mean, would you think that the people who are hassling with the PowerPoints, spending the most time on it, are the ones that would help you out the most in getting an agent up and running? And then those people might think that they're in threat of losing their jobs as a result of teaching the agents.
yeah, but it's unsustainable, right?
Yeah,
Like that's the thing is you you can't continue to ask people to pay $5,000-$10,000 to format a PowerPoint. Like
yeah,
that's not
right.
right.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
sure.
And so like you're right. There's
I,
from an ethics standpoint, I would make the argument, and I think it's the right argument, that if you're billing somebody out at that kind of rate, you're billing them out at that rate because they bring something special to the table,
mm-hmm.
and they spend their time focusing on building out that special capability, not on PowerPoints, right? And so, like,
Totally.
now the unethical side of that is like, well, we'll just cut them and make more profit. I
Yeah.
don't think that. I mean, that's a decision for ethicists in each company to make. I kind of lean more towards the let's build people up side, but
Yeah.
I am in both. So
Yeah. I guess the point I was trying to get to was you need to match the capability to the talent. Um,
okay.
and it's sort of like you've got some very talented people that you want to unleash their capability. And in the data space, in the data management space, for example, you got people spending 80% of their time on just cleaning up data.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that you're tackling that problem for them so you can use them for more important things than just cleaning up data.
Well, and
Because
the challenge,
yeah,
the challenge there, and this is a non-obvious thing that I learned from the big data stuff, is that some people really, really, really like cleaning up data, right? And so when you're like, hey, I need you to move it to the analytics side, they're like, no, 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 I just want to focus on getting the data in the ETL. Like, that's what I want to do, right? And so I was like this weird, I was like, why don't you just go like build like a clustering algorithm or something like that? And they were like, no, that sounds intimidating. I'll just stay here, right? And so there's a little bit of that you have to do there to get that whipped around, but like that's an organizational change problem, not so much like, oh, the AI is costing us our jobs
yeah,
problem.
yeah. Oh, that raises a good question. You've been in and around so many different things, and organizational change obviously always takes longer than trying to adopt the technology. And let's say you've got a certain level of maturity and you're able to adopt the technology at hand, but you know that there are these nagging organizational problems that are just going to be a burden on whatever levels of innovation the company wants to aspire to with the AI.
Yeah.
Is there a way to think about organizational change differently now with new technology like this, or is it still the same approach to trying to uh, improve the pace of change?
I don't. So here's what I would say to that. I don't think it's the technology that's necessarily driving a change in mindset. I would say
Hmm.
the lack of free money is changing the mindset, right? So there was time, when interest rates were really low, debt was basically free, that companies just didn't have an incentive to shift out of that kind of muck that they were in, right? And I would say now, with all the downward pressure, that's when you can start using. You have to use that as the cudgel and essentially say, look, AI is going to get you there, but it's really only going to get you there if you change these things about how you work, right?
Yeah.
And you can't have it's a balance, because you can't have the prerequisite to the AI cost be so cost prohibitive that they just ignore it or don't do it. So you have to find ways to, go in with a scalpel and say, do these 4 or 5 things. And your chance of success goes from 30% to 80%, right? And so it's a confluence of events more so than any kind of technology shift that's actually gotten us there. It's more just companies are like, just trying to figure out how to keep things moving right now.
Yeah, for sure. And at the same time, it would seem that the security space has gotten a lot more challenging because of the vulnerabilities just increasing exponentially. I'm just looking at it from the outside. Is that the case, or how are you
Well,
interpreting this?
yeah, yes. And there's a real issue right now. The keyword right now in security is tools rationalization. You go to the conferences, they're talking about AI and they're talking about content tools rationalization. And the reason is organizations have bought 70, 100, 200, 300, 400 solutions to go after the cybersecurity problem. And each one of those solutions has its own inertia, has its own dashboards a lot of times, has its own tooling. And so, yes, so you have this 1-2 punch, right? Where the threat itself is shifting, right? We're starting to see true, real kind of AI based attacks, which has a whole set of implications around that.
Yeah.
The speed at which those can take place at, and scale at which they can take place at. But then at the same time, you have organizations that have incrementally piecemeal tools together over the past 15 years without really an integration strategy per se. I mean, they kind of dump it all into one kind of,
Yeah.
Not to call it Splunk specifically, but like it wants like Splunk type apparatus or some kind of SIM. And right now they're finding themselves a little bit stuck where they're like, well, where do I cut costs? How do I reallocate capital?
Yeah.
And like, how do I defend against all this new stuff when I've got all this legacy stuff sitting around? So it's like, we're in probably year one of a 3 or 4 year cycle where I think you're going to see a lot of movement back to platforms, interestingly enough, and open ecosystems in the security space.
When you and I first met, we were talking about security and graphs, and you were building big graphs. Can you tell us specifically how graphs are going to help with the circumstance you just described?
Yeah, look, I think, and this is something that the God bless them for fighting this fight, but the semantic web and the semantic graph people have been fighting this fight for 20 or 30 years too, right? Where it's how, it's really interesting, right? Because so if you look at AI as it stands today, all of the LLMs, all the transformers operate on what's known as, and I don't want to get too mathy here, but I'm just going to dive down and come back up. And what's known as Euclidean space. It's very discrete. It's grid oriented. It's just kind of like everything is linear, and you can kind of predict what's going to happen next and things like that. Network infrastructures, network architectures, network threats are inherently non-Euclidean problems, and the graph is extraordinarily well structured to deal with that non-Euclidean problem set, right? So yes, you have 40,000 endpoints, but there's 2 of those that are actually doing the majority of the communication, right? And being able to understand where that risk pool sits, and not just where that risk pool sits from a technology standpoint, but where it sits from a business standpoint, where it sits from a geopolitical standpoint. The combination of what I would call kind of like network graphs and semantic graphs are real accelerators in being able to understand that problem set in a way. And so like we use, so for at VisibleARC, we use a diffusion model that operates on graphs. So the diffusion model is the same models that are run for like, generating images, generating songs, like those types of things. And the reason we didn't go with like an LLM is because the LLM just simply cannot comprehend and statistically understand the structure of a network the same way you can capture in a graph, right? And so there's information capture there, there's structure capture there, there's normalization that occurs in a way that can't occur. You can do it a little bit with like an adjacency matrix or a sparse matrix. You can kind of kludge some stuff together, but by and far, the graph is the most natural, cleanest way to represent that type of a data set, right? And that data set permeates throughout all security, computer networks, architecture, all that stuff. And so for me, which is a very natural progression to say, hey, let's look at graphs. Now, as it turned out, that actually wasn't where the industry was, although it seems to be kind of rotating there slowly over the past 10 years. So
right. So kind of a similar situation in security as exists in across the enterprise with enterprise software in general, which is graph is useful, perhaps being underutilized in some ways still, and there's a focus on what we would call application-centric approaches to security that could be improved if you had the visibility at the data layer of a graph, for
correct.
example.
And the challenge, I think the industry challenge right now is to give up on the concept of any one vendor bespokely owning that graph, right? And because what you have, otherwise that graph needs to be open to the entire enterprise and all tools across it, right? And otherwise you just end up in another walled garden situation where you're now stuck in somebody else's ecosystem. I think that's from a industry standpoint, that's a real challenge that we continue to fight with.
And so, companies have been investing in cloud services, public cloud, for 20 years now, almost. And I know, just talking to the security people at the firm you and I were with, they'd say, well, we've got duplicate tool sets. You've got the bespoke stuff that we're used to using, and then there's the stuff that is off the shelf at the cloud service provider that would seem to do many of the same things, and you sort of have to rationalize what your tool chain consists of. And you talked about the rationalization aspect of this, but then the cloud service provider, that's essentially kind of a walled garden in terms of your ultimate security goals. You've got some companies that are quite concerned about security for good reason. And so how are they approaching this?
I think what I would say, there are two fundamental approaches that I have seen. The first of which is to drag all their legacy tools up into the cloud, virtualize them, and run them that way, right? So you're essentially just using the cloud as another data center, and off you go. Now there's issues with that around transformation, modernization stuff. Are you actually, if you're just using the cloud just to run VMs, what do you like, just running a data center at that point? Like, who cares, right? But the cloud provider's not making it easy, right? Because the other side of that is they're dealing with it as two separate worlds. So you have the on-prem stuff and everything there, and then you have the cloud stuff and everything there, right? And this is what, if you look at Amazon's Fargate, and my good personal friend runs this for Microsoft, and he's going to kill me if he watches this and realizes I forgot the name of the product. But there's tools that they're building that allow you to move workloads from on-prem to off-prem and off-prem to on-prem, and shift things back and forth transparently. So they're trying to blur those lines a little bit, but there's really not a good. This goes back to the issue with 70, 100. A good number of those tools are bespoke things that the cloud providers, and this is assuming you're just in a single cloud, not a multi-cloud situation,
right,
that those cloud providers are providing to you as telemetry, right? And so all of that's to say, there are attempts to go after that problem, but it seems like the ones that are having the most success are just kind of treating them as two different environments, and then just dealing with the tool complexity of having to monitor them deal with them separately. So
yeah. There's a book called Software Wasteland that one of my mentors wrote back in the 2010s, and he just unpacked this whole issue of complexity and how problematic it was becoming. That it was just becoming overwhelming in terms of, you mentioned the concern about cost and how so much of the budget is being absorbed by applications that are underutilized, for example, or custom development that is, orders of magnitude more expensive than it needs to be in the case of governments that are spending way too much on it. The book talked about healthcare.gov as a poster child, and Health Sherpa as an example of how you could develop a clean running app that did the same thing for much less than what the Gov did. It continues to be a looming problem, this whole complexity issue, and we keep pushing it down the road. Is it going to become a huge security issue because of agentic AI? What are your thoughts about that? Have you been thinking about that kind of thing?
it's already a huge security issue, even without agentic AI, right? Like it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, in the kind of trust that exists, across substrates between these different silos. You get one silo, you get all of them. That type of structure really deeply problematic, right?
Yeah.
I don't. Here's the thing. I think we've been asking people to altruistically solve this problem for the past 15 years. And the message that has pretty clearly come back has been no. Like, right? Like, and so that's so, but I think altruism isn't really going to be the driving function anymore. It's going to be
Yeah.
budget cut. And so it's going to be really interesting as those budgets get cut. Does that become do people just try to bet on AI, or does that actually become a forcing function to simplify and tighten up the environment?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's just it's sort of like you're tempted to think about, let's just have a tabula rasa, just clear the slate and start over again, because there's so much confusion and old legacy architecture blended with new stuff that needs to be unleashed to solve these problems.
Well, and that's what we were trying. Like, you may or may not remember this, but like that's what we were arguing for 10 years ago with the cloud.
Yeah.
Was like, this is the clean slate. This is the clean table. Before you move things in the cloud, transform them, modernize them, clean them up, put them up there, right?
Yeah.
And everyone was like, "Cool, I'm going to get my antivirus working in the cloud," right? Like, so it's just like this, like. And so it was like a missed window, and so we keep having these, and I hope that's why I think it has to be a cost first function, and a cost forward function first, right? Where it's there has to be some externality driving this, because if we just ask people to do it because it's good hygiene, I just don't think they have the bandwidth, and they're dealing with their everyday problems. They're not, they're not looking at how do I completely fundamentally transform my security org.
Yeah, for sure. So what's happening in terms of your planning for 2026? What are you thinking about doing? Where's your company headed? VisibleARC?
Look, I think as I mentioned, I think the two keys there the two keys for 2026 as it relates to security are going to be modernization, cost rationalization, right? And then how do you actually implement and bring AI in to help do some of that stuff. I think the issue with AI for 2026 is going to be people are realizing that the data problem is a much harder problem than they initially gave it credit for. So all that's to say, it's like, if you look at, I spent the past 2 years essentially building out the model, proving the model works, those types of things. I think two things, right? One is, how do we pivot that from a luxury nice to have for the top of the industry, to something that can either enable skills, upskilling of talent. It can enable some kind of novel defense technique against new threats that simply doesn't have a defense today, or it can help save the organization money in some way, shape, or form, right? By collapsing other tool sets down, right? And so going into 2026, that's really the focus, is how do we not just cool that we have this AI that does this thing, and it's actually like, it's pretty interesting where you can build these synthetic environments. But then how do we fit that into the ecosystem that exists today, right? And how do we not just get the top, 5 customers, but how do we make that relevant for every security organization and make it part of their transformation modernization story?
Yeah.
So
when it comes to security, who do you follow? I mean, who are you reading?
I follow a lot. It's funny. The reason I laugh is because it's not like I check in with a lot of like the Brian Krebs and the security domain experts and those types of things, but I would say I'm much more focused on 2 things. What's happening geopolitically, and understanding the give and take there, because that ultimately is what drives security, because that's where kind of the biggest threats emerge out of.
Yeah.
And then 2, understanding. Well, I would say 3 things. 2, understanding what the regulatory environment of this is going to look like, obviously plays a huge role. And so really focusing in on where the different, not just the US side, but the EU, some of the countries like Malaysia, things like that, where they have really strict data, like Singapore, because those are going to drive a lot of decisions that are going to get made in business level AI over the next year. And then lastly, it's, what's actually happening in the broader, not just the broader kind of LLM ecosystem, but the broader AI ecosystem, outside of just image, text, music, image, text, sound type generators. Because I think we kind of focused in on AI as one of those 3 sets, right? Even your agentic process AI is kind of a text generating AI at the end of the day. And so what's happening outside of that, to help see around corners and see where there might be gaps that could actually be filled. So
yeah. Sounds like esoteric stuff that you're focused on.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to translate it down a couple layers, right? Because it's like looking at like geopolitical, regulatory, and like frontier AI environments is not exactly like the way to like have someone write a check for you, but ultimately you have to realize there's a 3 to 6 month lag between when they start writing about that and when you can actually commercialize it. So it's better to be in front of that a little bit and prepare for it rather than trying to chase the agentic AI stuff like everyone else is doing right now. So
yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, we covered a lot of ground today. I appreciate the time, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's really great connecting with you again.
Yeah, and people can reach out to you at the VisibleARC site or via LinkedIn when you're blogging, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free.
Yeah, and just a great guy to talk to. So thanks again, and we will sign off for now.
All right. Appreciate it, man.